Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a second here. I hope you are well and that your week is going okay so far. But 1 second. We will begin in a second. Thank you for joining me. 13th session, our B'nai Mitzvah session together of Talmud Tales. Hard to believe, 13 weeks that we've been going at this. So we'll get right into it. A couple just quick reminders about Zoom and the protocol of how we're going to go about doing this. As I always do, this webinar means that we're not going to be seeing each other. You can see me and I can hear you. So we're going to run through the text and I'll share some thoughts, and then of course we'll open it up for you to share. So there are a variety of ways in which you can do that, using the chat function, the Q&A function, or you can virtually raise your hand. So those are the three ways in which you can engage with me, and then I'll be able to call on you and unmute you so that we can talk. So we'll do that once we go through the text together. We have a fascinating text. I hope you've had a chance to look at it. If you haven't, I'll put it on the screen so you'll be able to read along with us. It is, the way I see this is, it's another story that I think, given what's going on in this country in these last couple of weeks with the death of George Floyd and the protests, that this is another story that made me think about some of the themes that we all need to be aware of. The things that now we have to start doing our own work, our introspective work, to really think about what's our role and our responsibility moving forward. How do we bring about change? And I think this story is dealing with that. So let's get into it. Of course, let's start with the blessing of engaging in the study of Torah. So feel free to join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher krishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity to engage in the study of Torah together. All right, here we go. Fascinating, weird story about a man, Satan coming and dressing up like a homeless beggar who is sick, and the reaction from this man, Pelimo. Pelimo is the main character along with Satan. So really, I want you to be thinking about, what is Satan's role in this story? What is Satan trying to teach? What is Pelimo's role, or his lack of role, or what does he come to realize, or what lesson is he being taught through the story? And there are some other characters too, unnamed characters, the other people in Pelimo's household. So what role or responsibilities do they have? And of course, how can you be thinking about this in the context of your own life and about the world in which we're living right now? And I found some connections there. So we'll read it through first once, and then we'll go back and I'll break it down and share some of my thoughts, and then we'll open it up for comments. Okay, so here we go. This comes from Kiddushin 81b, a section that is talking about Kiddushin, which is about marriage. And there are a few examples here where Satan comes into play with characters throughout this section of Kiddushin. So this is one of these sections where Satan is the main character at play. Pelimo used to say every day, "An arrow in Satan's eyes." One day, it was the eve of Yom Kippur, Satan disguised himself as a poor man and went and called out at Pelimo's door. Bread was brought out to him. He pleaded, "On such a day when everyone is within, shall I be out?" Thereupon he was taken in and bread was offered him. "On a day like this," he urged, "when everyone sits at the table, shall I sit alone?" He was led and sat down at the table. As he sat, his body suddenly was covered with suppurating sores, and he behaved repulsively. They told him, "Sit properly." They gave him a glass of liquor, and he coughed and spat phlegm into it, and they scolded him. He fell and died. Then Pelimo heard people crying out, "Pelimo has killed a man! Pelimo has killed a man!" He fled and hid in the bathroom. Satan followed him, and he fell before him. When Satan saw how Pelimo was suffering, he disclosed his identity. And he asked Pelimo, "Why have you been cursing me?" Pelimo asked, "Then how should I speak?" Satan said to him, "You should say, 'May the merciful one rebuke Satan.'" That's the whole story. Okay, so we have Pelimo, we have Satan, we have the people of his household. We have this happening in the context of the eve of Yom Kippur, right? A very important transitional moment in the Jewish calendar, and a spiritual transformative moment as well for everyone individually and then for us collectively, right? So that's the setting of what's going on right here in this story. So now I'm going to share my screen again. Let's go back and let's start to break this down and try and understand, what are we supposed to be learning from the story? What's the lesson that we're supposed to be taking from this? What are the rabbis teaching us? And then what's our own modern interpretation of what we can be learning? Okay, so it begins with Pelimo saying, every day an arrow in Satan's eyes, right? In other words, this is him as if he's always saying, Satan can't tempt me, right? There's this concept in our tradition of Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. This idea that there's the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. There's the good inclination and the evil inclination. And Satan, of course, representing that evil inclination. Now, I want you to remember that the evil inclination is not necessarily just about us going out and doing bad things, right? There can be the evil inclination can come into our lives with the sin of omission, the sin of neglect, the things that we're not doing. But here we have this man who is so self-righteous that he believes that he is so good that he can say, Satan has no power over me whatsoever. I am not tempted by the Yetzer Hara, by the evil inclination. I am a good person and I know it, and I am willing to even say it and shout it from the rooftops how good of a person I am, right? And I think there are those moments in our own lives where we feel really good about who we are and how we act, right? We've all had those experiences, including myself, where you feel, whether you're looking at your children and thinking, God, I'm actually doing a pretty good job of raising these kids, no matter how old they may be. I'm doing really well with how I'm taking care of other people. I've been a good friend lately, right? There are these moments where we deservedly so sometimes pat ourselves on the back for how good a job we are doing and how well we are acting. That's a slightly different from what Pelimo seems to be doing here, which is this idea that he really is very sure that he is a good person and he's acting in the proper way on a daily basis. Okay, so one day on the eve of Yom Kippur, now imagine this is the last meal that people are having before a 24-hour fast day, and the evening where people traditionally gather together with their family before they go to synagogue, before they hear Kol Nidre, where they are preparing themselves in all white and getting ready for a day of self-reflection and purification. So that's the setting for when the story takes place. And Satan comes. Now, unlike the Christian understanding of Satan or Satan in the Jewish tradition is more like a messenger of God. It's not, the story of Job, for example, has the character of Satan, of Satan, who comes and tests Job. So Satan is not separate from God. Satan is a messenger, an angel of God. So when we're reading about Satan here, we're reading about a test. This is about Satan really plays the role of the tester. And so it's God vis-a-vis Satan, who is coming to test Pelimo. That's how we're supposed to understand Satan in this way. And really, Satan usually plays the role of trying to unmask the characters and try and help them to realize something about themselves, maybe usually the negative piece of themselves that they hadn't been aware of before, right? So here, this is what's happening. Satan comes and disguises himself as a poor man, which happens a lot, and went and called out at Pelimo's door. Okay, so it's Erev Yom Kippur. The family is gathered. We imagine that Pelimo is a wealthy person. He's not a rabbi, but he's someone of stature. And this homeless man, this beggar, comes and calls out at the door, right? And bread was brought out to him. He pleaded, on such a day when everyone is within, shall I be out? Thereupon he was taken in and bread was offered him. I want to break this down. So first, he's at the front of the house and bread was brought out to him, right? So already the household is not welcoming in this beggar, or we can just call him Satan, is not inviting Satan in. He's really just basically tossed bread out. So then I think this is the really key moment in the story. this character, this beggar, the Satan, pleads, when everyone is within, shall I be out? This is a story, and one of the key themes here is really about the story of who is in and who is out. And I think what we're experiencing in the world right now and in our country right now is a recognition of those who have been on the outs, those who have been out, and many of us have been in, right? Those of us who are white, who live in the neighborhoods that we tend to live in, who have had a very different upbringing than those who have been on the outs. Mainly, I'm talking about the African-American community at this point, right? In the context of what we're dealing with in these last couple of weeks. So here we have this man pleading from the outside saying, when everyone else is inside, why am I out, right? And so once he says that, once this character is finally able to say that, then the people are like, oh, okay. And they take him in and bread was offered him. We don't know much more about where he was taken, other than the fact that he was just taken inside. But then we realize that he isn't even at the table. They brought him inside, but they left him not amongst the people of the household, but somewhere else where he could have his bread. He's now inside a little, but really not at the table, figuratively and literally. On a day like this, he urged, when everyone sits at the table, shall I sit alone? And he was led and sat down at the table. Okay, so let's pause there. The table. To me, I think about the table, I think about the Shabbat table. And as you may be aware, that the Shabbat table, it has replaced the sacrificial altar that existed at the time of the temple. When we go through the Torah and we're talking about that portable sanctuary, and we go and we read the book of Leviticus, which of course is bar and bat mitzvah students' worst nightmare, is to have to read from the book of Leviticus, because it talks about animal sacrifices and bodies and pus and all these other nasty things. What we have with that altar is that was the form of how we connected to God, right? This idea of karov, of korban, of the sacrifice as a way in which we connect to God, where we come closer to God. So the table here, I think, represents what was the sacrificial altar, but now represents the table where we are supposed to recognize, as we do on Shabbat evening, that the table is supposed to represent the gifts that we are giving to God, our connection to God, that the table is a place where we are willing to sacrifice a piece of ourselves in order to be connected to something bigger, right? So here the table is really this idea that we need to be thinking about, and in this story here as well, what are we willing to sacrifice? If this table represents an altar on which we are supposed to sacrifice pieces of ourselves for the greater good, here, this character, Satan, is calling out this family to say, you need to be willing to sacrifice something. I deserve a seat at the table. And in addition to that, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to bring the outsider to your table and to sit with you? Are you going to sacrifice your assumptions, your complacency, your self-righteousness? That right now is a time where we need to be thinking about not only that people need to be invited to the table, but that when we sit at the table with those who are different than ourselves, who have a different narrative, a different history, whatever it may be, that requires a sacrifice on our own parts in order to make the space at that table for everyone to be heard and to really get meaning out of what it means to actually sit at the table together. So I think that's what's happening here as he's calling them out about the fact that he's in their house, but they haven't even invited him to sit at the table with them, right? So he was led, and finally, after each one of the times where he is prodding them, right? Already the mistake here is that they are completely passive, the people of this household, on the eve of Yom Kippur, the time where they are supposed to be focused on how to become better people. It is requiring the outsider, this beggar, is the one who is constantly trying to prod them to make some change and to take care of him. And I think we're also at a time where now there are people out there, especially in the African-American community, who are saying, we've been trying to be at the table with the rest of this country for a long time, and you haven't done it. Now is the time, right? Knocking on the door, saying, let's have a seat at the table. Let's make change. And this is really the failure already we can see of the people in this household is their inability to take any initiative, and that they are completely passive, that the person who is in pain, the outsider, is the one who's having to take all the initiative in order for change to occur. And that's not the way the system is supposed to be. So there's a critique in this story just around that. So he sits at the table finally, and his body is suddenly covered with these pussy sores that are, disgusting. It's really disgusting. And he behaved repulsively. And they told him, sit properly, right? We don't know, because it's Satan. Is he testing them? Is he behaving repulsively on purpose to prod them? Is he behaving repulsively because he's starting to get sicker and sicker? We don't really know, and it doesn't really matter, I think. But they tell him, sit properly, right? I don't care about your pain or the disgust that I'm becoming aware of with my eyes about what your experience is, sir, who's sitting at the table. Just sit properly. I don't want to see that negativity. Sure, sit at the table with us, but act appropriately, right? So yet another mistake. They're already missing a key piece. Not only were they being passive, and now they're trying to dictate how this man is supposed to act, even though clearly he is sick. If he has all these sores and he's behaving in such a way, there's something going on. There's something wrong. And instead of trying to understand that, they're already trying to dictate the way he's supposed to act. They gave him a glass of liquor because now he's been sitting at the table and he hasn't even been offered wine or whatever it may be. And he coughed and he spat phlegm into it, and they scolded him. Now, again, just like right before, we don't know if he's doing this on purpose or if his sickness is just causing him to do things that are not comfortable to see. And I think we've seen plenty of uncomfortable images recently through the media about what's happening in our own country. And so sometimes we want to avert our eyes, and sometimes we just want to say, no, I don't want to see that. And so they again scold him for the fact that he is in this pain or he is in this state. They misinterpret him, right? Because whether he's doing that on purpose or not, they're not asking, are you okay? What's going on? They purely just jump to conclusions and attack him for whatever he's doing. And they do it without really understanding where he's coming from. And they don't ask for clarification, right? Another teaching I think that's coming right here is we need to seek clarification from the other, from those in pain. And this can be, we can talk about this in the context of Black Lives Matter. We can talk about this in the context of any relationship, or anytime we are witness to someone who is doing something that we don't understand, that makes us really uncomfortable. Do we jump automatically to conclusions, or do we engage in some kind of conversation, or do we ask a question in order to find out what's really going on so that we can act accordingly? They don't do that. They just jump to conclusions, which human nature, we sometimes have that urge to do. So he falls down and he dies. Is this from illness that he has? Is this from the shame of how he's been treated, right? Regardless, there is a process that has gone on that has led to his death, okay? And then, this is so weird because we haven't actually heard from Pelimo except for the very beginning line where every day he would say an arrow in Satan's eyes, and then the rest of the story up until this point doesn't include Pelimo himself at all. It's his household. Here, then all of a sudden he hears people crying out, Pelimo has killed a man, Pelimo has killed a man. Weird. Where has he been? I think what this is trying to teach us is that it's not just about an individual here, right? Even though we may target one individual for being responsible for the death of this character, in this case, this beggar, even though we may target one specific person, that sometimes it's easier to try and do that when in fact there's an entire system behind that person that has allowed that death to occur, right? And I'm talking now both about what's happened in our country in the last weeks, and I think in our own lives, where we have where it's sometimes much easier to target an individual as responsible for an act or for carelessness, when in fact what's really behind this is that there was an entire household who was allowing this process to occur, that this man's death, Satan's death here, this beggar's death, was at the hands of negligence on an entire household, not just Pelimo. And that Pelimo is representative of a much bigger issue, right? So when we're thinking about George Floyd, we're thinking about that officer Chauvin, who was on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It's not just that officer, it's not just the other 3 officers, it is an entire system at play here. So if we only target that officer, we're missing the bigger picture. And that is a lesson for us in all of life. It's not just in the case of George Floyd, right? That we have to realize that there's an entire system behind the ways in which things occur in our lives and in our society that we need to be starting to target. And we need to be tapping into that and trying to understand how that system occurred, right? Then we can start to make some change. Okay, so then Pelimo goes, he flees his house and he hides in the bathroom. An important thing about the bathroom, back then, not everyone had a bathroom in their house. Actually, no one had a bathroom in their house. The wealthy, from the research I did, those who were wealthy were able to have a bathroom close by to their house, so they didn't have to schlep very far. But a lot of people had to go to the public bathroom area. So we are to assume that he's going to the public bathroom, right? It's Kol Nidre, it's Erev Yom Kippur. He leaves his house. One would think that he would run to the synagogue, maybe, right? In the context of where we're talking, this isn't just some normal day, right? This is preparation for Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre. But he goes and he hides in the bathroom. So why the bathroom? And I'm curious your thoughts on all these different things when I'm done. There's something, the bathroom is the place of refuse, of disgust, the place where we would assume this beggar would be in, that's the kind of place where the beggar would be. Yet it's also a place, and I think symbolically what the story is trying to teach us is that he flees to the place where actually he's going to learn his lesson. And his lesson is taking place in that place of refuse and in a place where everyone is actually equal. Now, there's a book that my children used to love called Everyone Poops, right? And it's a storybook for kids. And it talks about all the different animals that poop and how humans do as well, and that everyone does this, right? And so I actually think that there's something to that when it comes to this story and why he flees to the bathroom. There's an equality that comes with the vulnerability of being in the bathroom, right? There is no socioeconomic difference when it comes to the fact that everyone needs to use the bathroom. And when you are in the bathroom, you're in a place of vulnerability, and everyone is in that place of doing the same thing. So I think there's a lesson here about the fact that he needs to go to that place of vulnerability. He needs to go and sit in the place that is representative of the thing that he was trying to ignore when it was in his own home. And that's the place when we are willing to go to the place of vulnerability, where we are willing to get dirty, so to speak, and have the conversations and understand the mindset that is really not comfortable. It is smelly. It is disgusting. It is not the place we want to be. And you can imagine what kind of bathrooms they were back in the day. Just imagine the public, the porta potties. Imagine all of that all the time. That's the kind of setting when his nose is attuned to the disgust of the system. That's when he's going to be able to go through this transformation. It's not at the synagogue. It's not on the high horse. We've read other stories in the past in this class about the fact that it's on the high horse where problems sometimes occur, and that the rabbis throughout the Talmud are teaching us lessons about the need to be vulnerable and to get off the high horse and to go to the places that really you can find change. So he goes there, he goes to the bathroom and undergoes this transformation, because now Satan follows him and he fell before him. Now we can read this either way. Is it that Pelimo falls before Satan, or vice versa? Is this that Satan again is dying in front of this man in this place, or the way I read it is that Pelimo is falling before this man who assumably was dead at his house and now has come back and is standing in front of him in the bathroom. That would be pretty scary. And when Satan sees how Pelimo was suffering, he disclosed his identity. And finally, the shift begins to occur, where there's this reversal of the roles, where the virtuous man, supposedly the self-righteous virtuous man, is now bowing down before the person for whom he had neglected and how his whole household had neglected. And now we get to see it's only when we are willing to bow down to those things and the concepts and the people and the stories that are really uncomfortable that we've potentially been ignoring, even if we're good people. It's when we bow down and when we give over to the fact that we need to understand them, that change can occur. So he sees him, he discloses his identity. And so he asks Pelimo, why have you been cursing me? I mean, I've just seen how you've been acting, Pelimo, in your household. Why have you been cursing me? Why have you been saying, an arrow in Satan's eye? And Pelimo asks, well, then how should I speak? In other words, it's still not clear that Pelimo has completely learned his lesson, but he's aware enough to finally ask a question. You realize this is the first question that anyone from Pelimo and his household has asked up until this point. Finally, he asks a question. And what he's asking is, I don't even know, teach me. I'm not even aware of what I'm supposed to do. And this is a time in our country where those of us who are white, who have not experienced what it means to be Black in this country, need to be asking that question. How should I speak? How should I act? What should I know? This is a time for us to be asking a lot of questions, not necessarily to run to solutions. I was listening to Bishop Ulmer, who is the pastor at our partner church here in Los Angeles. And he was talking about how this idea that the wound is still open, right? When the wound is still open, you can't necessarily move to the healing process and figuring out how to fix this for the future when there's still an open wound, right? And this is still an open wound. And we have a lot of responsibility right now to be listening, to be standing beside, to be asking questions, not necessarily to come up with all the solutions yet. There will be time for that, but this is a long, long process, right? So here Pelimo finally asks a question and says, how should I speak? Teach me something. I want to know. At this point, I'm well aware that I have messed up, but I don't even know what to say. So what should I say? And Satan says, you should say, may the merciful one rebuke Satan. What does that mean? May God rebuke Satan. You are not in a place, Pelimo, to be talking about how righteous you are. That is God's role, to rebuke Satan and to do that. Your responsibility is not to pretend that you are holier than thou, but to recognize that the divine presence, the genuine divine presence, rests in the other, in the downtrodden, in the stranger. That's where we need to be. One of the really important lessons here is that this is that we find through Satan's character, which is representing the other, we find a connection to the divine. And when we listen to that voice, we can discover new things and we can create change. That the filth, so to speak, that Satan's role, the Satan character here, the character that is uncomfortable for us to engage with sometimes, or the character which we don't even know how to engage with, that can be a test for us to really help elevate our own actions and our own understanding of the world around us. That we suffer from a spiritual blindness, no matter how good people we are. We still are blind in some ways, and we all have the responsibility, especially now, to be opening up our eyes, to recognize the other, to do our part to start to bring about that change, to sometimes go into those gritty, nasty places within ourselves where we have to be honest with maybe our own misunderstandings, our own biases, and then to work through that, to ask questions and to engage in the conversation without just scolding or trying to come to conclusions before we really engage in the process. So there's a lot in the story. a great story. I think I love the story. One of these really funky Talmud stories with Satan, and it'd be a great short film. So at this point, if there are any comments, questions, other interpretations about elements of the story, things that stand out to you, that that you feel connected to, certain elements from the story, if you want to raise your hand and ask those questions, or share, now would be the time to do that. You can virtually raise your hand, chat, do the Q&A. I know sometimes it takes a minute. I can always count on Jeff. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Is that a positive or a negative, Rabbi? I don't know.
It's a positive. Don't worry. No, it's a positive.
Well, the only issue with the political ramifications of this story that you related so elegantly is that you always have one side culpable and having to raise their level of involvement in order to find the cure. And yet the lesser side never seems to address the problem in the way they interact in society. They choose not to move towards a solution. They somehow, an example is when I watch the Business Channel and I see all these huge hedge fund entrepreneurs who are Black, their voice is not there for their people. I do not see much in the way of religious fervor from their churches trying to point out how they can move forward. It's not just to be received, or let's say the 90% of our population being responsible totally for the behaviors of the 10%. And it's a difficult setting for me personally, that the expectations are always on our side, particularly Jewish involvement with the Black cause. I mean, we have a common history of oppression, yet our people have achieved many times. You get immigrants coming here in 1910, didn't know a language, who worked hard, who chose to learn a language, who chose to alter behavior to become part of a society on a successful level.
Okay, well, I want to stop you there. I get your point. I think, Jeff, first of all, you have to be very careful with how you frame some of these comments, because there are a lot of different ways in which those can be taken. So I just want to say that. I think, and I'm going to use this in the frame of the story. This is not a one-way narrative that this story is representing. This is a dialogue. And for most of the story, the dialogue is only one way, and it's that person, the oppressed person, who is calling out and saying, I want to make change. I think we have a history in this country of the African-American community calling out, saying there needs to be change. And we have a long history in this country of there being oppression. Now, Jews have been going through that, but in America, not the same way that the African-American community has been treated. And we don't have a history of literally being enslaved in this country the way the African-American community has been. And yet they, just like the Jewish community, have achieved a lot, even given all of the things that have been holding them down, so to speak. But this is not a story and a narrative where it's just Pelimo who's going to be solving this. This is a conversation where the beggar, the Satan character in this case, is calling out and saying, I want to be a part of it. Bring about change. Be my partner. Let's sit down and do this together. Because just like the Jewish history, Jews didn't just come up on their own, right? There has always been about a collaboration and partnership. And it's about how do you go through a process of joining together, right? The Jews were a key part of even creating the NAACP. There is a partnership that is needed, and that we have to not see that this is all on the shoulders of one person. That is not the narrative that Judaism would say is the case for any issue that exists in the world. The only way that we are going to overcome many of these things is through a partnership, and is through working together and recognizing that everyone can play a role and everyone can do something to bring about change. And as soon as we say it's on the other, that's the detriment that this story is even talking about. As soon as you put all of that pressure on one person or one group to do it themselves, that is a failure. It doesn't work. And so we have to really see that we are not, as Jews, holier than thou because we've been able to succeed, so to speak. We have a responsibility, just like every other group that has gone through a sense of oppression, that we have a responsibility, and we have to do our due diligence in helping to support everyone to have a sense of tzedek, of justice, of having enough. And so I think that's a really important, you bring up a really common understanding that exists out there, but I think it's really important as Jews for us to start changing that narrative and seeing we have a responsibility and we can help. Our goal, if tzedakah is about bringing about justice, it's not about trying to let other people do it on their own. So let's help, let's make a change. So what if it's gonna be hard? That's what it is. It's gonna be tough, and we gotta do it together, and we can't do anything other than to lift up one another. So I do appreciate you sharing, Jeff, as I always do, but I do disagree with you on some of this. I wanna turn over to Claudia. Go ahead, Claudia.
Okay, I have three comments, and that's sort of unrelated to each other. But one is, I absolutely love the way you drew the parallelisms between, the Pelimo story and what's going on right now. And the second one is, I also watched Bishop Ulmer, and he said something that really struck me, which was, it's white people who are going to end, racism. To which Rabbi Lida said, he talked about the Talmud and how the Talmud says the prisoner cannot free himself. And, like everyone else, this period has brought, a lot of questions, a lot of looking inwards, because it's not enough to just say, oh, I'm colorblind, or I have, friends, just to say I'm not a racist, and, I hired people of color in my business or what have you, is just not enough. Maybe we are not the ones to be talking about the solutions, but certainly we should be listening and asking questions, as you said, and be there and be told what we need to do. How can we help? And the third thing, it's Talmud related. I'm curious to know from which tractate, in which context was this Pelimo story placed?
Yeah, so this is this story. Thank you for all your comments, Claudia. This is in the context specifically a bunch of stories where characters are engaging with Satan, and Satan is tempting them. But in the greater context, this is in Kiddushin, is about the relationships. Kiddushin is about marriage. There's Erusin and Kiddushin, the two parts of the marriage ceremony. So this is really a section about relationships. But in the closer context, there are a variety of stories where Satan is tempting different characters. All right, thank you, Claudia. I'm going to move on now to Susan. Hi, Susan. Susan, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have two channels of that. I think Jeff actually raised a good point. And some of the point is how much is Black and how much is income equality. And often that goes together. And also for the Latinos, they're in the poorer areas. But, and it was something to keep in mind too, with possibilities of education and ways to, for those poor communities to lift themselves up. But yes, we're dealing with police injustice at this point. But what got me in this story was how he coughed and spat phlegm into the cup. That is disgusting. And and yes, it's really disgusting.
Yeah.
Yes, they should have asked, are you sick? But on the other hand, well, they scolded him, but they should have said, this is the table. We expect not uncouth behavior here, or something along those lines in terms of lifting people up in terms of their behavior. Yeah. So what do you, that's comparable then to the toilet, the outhouse that you have that's dealing with human waste. So what is your take?
Yeah, my take on that is that, yes, we recognize that there are certain, thank you, Susan, that there are certain ways in which we should all act, right? However, what I think this story is trying to teach us is that they go immediately to scolding this man when the most basic question, right? Imagine you're walking down the street and someone is staggering around, right? You may assume they're drunk, and therefore you might already in your mind assume all kinds of negative things about them, but maybe they're going through like some health issue all of a sudden. And so what's our natural inclination for some that the critique of this story is trying to raise is that our natural inclination sometimes is to just make assumptions about what that person is doing, and that maybe what that person is doing is either on purpose or to spite us or is negative and is disgusting, when in fact, what if they had just said, "Are you okay? You seem very sick. Can we help you?" Because if someone is acting that way at the table, and we know that most of people know that that isn't the proper way in which people mostly act at the table, then instead of scolding, maybe we should be saying, well, clearly there's something wrong here. Are you okay? Do you need help? What's going on? Do you need to be excused? There are many different ways in which we can handle it. And so, yes, there is a way in which we should be acting in the world. But when there are people who are not acting according to the way in which we want them to act, do we just automatically make assumptions and potentially scold them? Or do we ask the question of what's really going on? Because if we're scolding before we know, then it's on us. If we ask the question and we find out that this character was doing it on purpose to spite them, well, that changes the conversation, in which case he would be, he could be scolded and said, well, I'm sorry, sir, if you're going to act that way, we're going to have to ask you to please leave. As opposed to if he said, I'm sick, I'm dying, then they could have said, oh, let's get you help. So I think that's where we're supposed to be focusing in this story, what the rabbis are trying to teach us about, since it is in the context of Erev Yom Kippur, this moment where we are supposed to be hyper aware of how we treat other people, that this is an example of how even on Erev Yom Kippur, we need to be extra cautious. We have to be extra vigilant in how we're interacting with the people around us. And I would say right now, what makes this so relevant is we need to be doing that more than ever. First, it was COVID and we were in quarantine. Then we were in curfew, right? And now we're all starting to go out into the world again. And I've said this before, we have to be aware of how we are interacting with other people. And before we jump to conclusions, we need to be asking the questions. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
Yes, okay, Sydney.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. And also for the story and for your teaching. I was particularly, there were so many places to go with this, but one of the things that really sticks with me is your discussion about the role of the Shabbat table, the role of the table that's set. And, when we think of who's at the table, what are we sacrificing? That whole concept that this replaces sacrifice means, to me, and I'm thinking about this, who's at the community table? And if we think back, as Jews, yes, we had to leave everything. We've had pogroms, we've had the Shoah, we've had all these things, but where is the community? And for us and for most people, it starts with their families, goes out to their faith communities, to the community, the state, the nation, etc. And what we're seeing now so much with this like double whammy of COVID, racial injustice, the illness that's just infecting our table has roots. And one of them that I've learned recently is that our communities were built and we could form congregations like Wilshire Boulevard Temple where it is because of people having access to the GI Bill, to education. There was a change that allowed so many people to become middle class and upper middle class and more within the Jewish community, the GI Bill was not offered to Black GIs. So they could not establish homes in communities where they had home ownership. This is not saying that we don't have big problems and that there haven't been efforts, many, to help and to include. But it just seems to me that we need to think about who's at the table and who's in our community. And even, in reading this story, Satan is disguised, just as the Messiah is disguised. So we never know. And I think that that's the challenge to us. That's the challenge that I think about. Who's in my community? Who do I need to bring in? And how do I listen before I figure anything else out? So.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate those. That's great. Thank you. Merle. Hi, Merle.
So I'm thinking about this, and when we talk about who the others are, we have to think even beyond the Black or Hispanic community. The Indian reservation is 6 blocks from my house here in Scottsdale, and there's a huge coterie of people from the Jewish community who either work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers, as well as grant writers to get them money. And we have friends who are farmers on the reservation who also teach the reservation people how to farm and farm properly and healthy. But I think we have to think beyond just the issue that's been in front of us for so many days now, that there are other people out there that aren't being talked about right now who are also suffering, who need a ton of help. And I'm proud of the people that I know that work for the BIA or work for the reservations, who are giving a lot of time and not making very much money, but they're out there helping that other and inviting them to what they do as a family or in their schools or scouts and stuff like that. So they get to learn and benefit from what we know. So I think we just have to think beyond just the people that are in our face constantly, that we have to think that we live in communities, that there's a lot more oppression out there that most of us realize that's not as visible.
Yes, great. Yes, thank you, Merle. Yes, right now we're focused on a community in this country that has faced systemic racism and oppression, but they're not the only ones, right? The African American community, as Merle points out, is not the only community in this country that's faced that. There's a lot of work to be done, and it goes, of course, beyond policing. It goes to a lot of issues that are really deep, that are going to take a long time for us to deal with. And one of the ways, one of the questions that was raised by Carol was, how do we recognize engaging not just with the African American community, but with our government? And one of the ways we do that is voting. There were some challenges in Georgia a couple of days ago with the voting process, and it's going to be really interesting to see how people start to use their voice legislatively. And one of the ways that we can to really think about, how do we bring about change by voting for what we care about and what our values are. And that I hope that all of us, when it comes to election time, any election time, whether it's local or national, really goes back to Jewish values, to recognize that our tradition has a whole system that doesn't try to simplify the complexities of issues, right? We are not a people who try and simplify things. And that's why these texts are complicated, because we are supposed to look at everything through the lens of complexity. And to me, that's what's so wonderful about Judaism, is that it doesn't simplify things. It doesn't create rose-colored glasses, that there are a lot of issues and a lot of elements and a lot of angles. Jeff, who gave the first comment, versus other people, right? We all are coming in from a Jewish community, just like every other community, with a lot of perspectives that all deserve to be heard. And we have to ask a lot of questions, and we have to try and work slowly but surely on fixing a lot of issues. And I think, of course, right now, it's important for us to recognize that there are certain times that we need to put extra effort into supporting certain groups of people, because they need it at that time and they deserve it. And so I think we are in one of those times that doesn't neglect all the other people. It doesn't neglect, there are some people out there saying, well, you know, anti-Semitism still exists. Of course, that's never going to go away. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be supporting other people who are oppressed just because anti-Semitism still exists. We can do both. We can keep fighting anti-Semitism and keep educating people and keep asking questions. And we can also support other people and try and make their lives better. Because if other people's lives are better, it's going to be better for us, right? We have been a people that I think have learned the lesson that shalom bayit, peace in the home, which is a really important value, is not just about finding peace in our own homes and about how do you create a space in your home that is one of peace and prosperity, but the greater home being the world, that shalom bayit, a peace in our global home, is one in which you have to be working and building relationships with one another and supporting one another, and then we all benefit, we all thrive from that. And so that I think is really important at this time, not for us to focus on divisiveness, but really to see that the challenging part of unifying, that's not easy for us to do. I mean, the Jewish community, God forbid we are unified on anything, but that doesn't mean we stop the conversation or don't engage in it. And I think there are times when, even if the conversation doesn't necessarily directly affect us, that we have an obligation. And I think Judaism is saying that, and I think we're in that time. We're almost out of time. There are a lot of great comments. If you're on the webinar chat, I don't have time to really read through all of them out loud, but I really do recommend that you look at the chain in the chat room. There are a lot of wonderful comments and thoughts about like ingesting versus expelling. What are we ingesting? What are we expelling? Lots of other great things. So we've been doing this for an hour, a great conversation. I really do appreciate. I'm sorry we didn't get to go back to people for other comments as well, but I hope you can take this story and delve into it even more and struggle with it and have conversations, have some of these tough conversations. Even though Jeff and I disagreed on kind of where he was coming from, that doesn't mean that we don't engage in the conversation. It doesn't mean I shut him out. I know Jeff, I know you have your hand raised, but we're out of time, but I know that you'll be back next week. We can always have more conversations. Also, my email is at the top of all those pages, all the text sheets that I give out every week. Feel free. There have been people who've reached out to me and we've had email conversations. I'm also happy to talk to people on the phone or in Zoom, so we can have conversations that go beyond this hour time together. I really do encourage you to really see this as an opportunity to have these conversations beyond the walls of our Zoom conversation that we have on Thursdays. But I really do appreciate everyone. I appreciate all the perspectives. We have so much work to do in our own lives and in the world. And I wish you this Shabbat, a Shabbat of peace and reflection, an opportunity to think about how can you at your Shabbat table create a space for more voices, more perspectives to be heard, for you to be willing to sacrifice some of your own sense of security, not physical security, but your own sense of security in order to really maybe find those elements that are disturbing, either about yourself or about your family or about your friends or about the world, and to sit with that and to have the table be an opportunity where we can have those discussions and we can find nourishment from those discussions, because that's what we need. We really do. Wishing you an early Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all. And I will look forward to learning with you again next week. Bye. Thank you.